What is up, everybody, and welcome back to another video. I am the Hobbyist, and today is going to be part 1 of my RC soldering tutorial. And today we are going to be covering soldering battery connectors, which is one of the most common things that you'll find yourself soldering in our RC hobby. So I'm going to be doing a quick how-to demonstration and a little bit of do's and don'ts as we go along. So without any further procrastination, let's get right into it. So you're going to need some basic materials, obviously, when you're soldering. The first of which is a soldering iron. Obviously, this one's just a cheap 35-watt Weller soldering iron. And I've been using this for a while and it works pretty well. You're going to need some solder. Now, there's a couple different types of solder you can use. Most people use lead solder because it's the easiest to solder, but I don't use that because when you melt lead solder, lead gets into the air and you can breathe it in. It's just not safe for you. So this is silver core solder, which is a little bit harder to solder, but the results are about the same and you don't run the risk of hurting yourself. As well as that, you're going to need some safety glasses because when you do melt solder, little bits of solder can go flying. So you want to make sure that you're safe there. Next, you're going to need a pair of pliers, which is these ones right here, needle nose pliers. You're going to need the thing that you're soldering, obviously. This isn't a battery or an ESC, but it is a engine heater from ProTech. I use this on my T-Max. But it uses a battery connector, so that's what I'm using for the demonstration, since this needs a new plug anyway. You're also going to need the battery connector itself. Make sure that you have the correct side of the battery connector. You don't want to go through all of this work only to find out that you got the wrong battery connector. You're also going to want some heat shrink tubing of some sort, as well as a lighter or heat gun to shrink it. Some tools to make the job go smoother. Wire strippers are very handy. If you don't have these, then that's okay. You can use either angle cutters and you just have to be a bit careful, or you can use a hobby knife. This is to cut away the insulation that is on the end of the wire because you have to remove some of that. And finally, you're going to want something to hold the wires and battery connector. This right here is a handy little, like mini solder station that somebody gave to me. I don't remember what brand it is, but it holds wires and battery connectors. If you don't have one of these, like I just got this, what I used to do is I would take a pair of pliers and rubber band the handles together, and then that'll hold it, and you can let go and it'll hold the connector just fine. So if you don't have something like this, then you can use that method. But for the sake of this video, I'm just going to use this right here. So with all the materials laid out, let's get started with soldering. Right. So as I said, this is my ProTech engine heater. I've never actually used this because it had the wrong connector. It had a Dean's connector on it, and I don't have any batteries that have Dean's connectors. So I'm going to be soldering on an XT60 connector. So the first step is to remove some of the insulation off of the wires. So what you do if you have these wire strippers is you line it up with the hole that is the correct size, which in this case is this one, and remove, it'll be different for different plugs, but I would recommend about that much. Can you see it? About from my nail over, about that much wire. And yeah, and all you do with these wire strippers is pinch and kind of wiggle it, and it'll come off like so. So you do both sides of that, and then I'll put you back on. Once you've got your wires set up, I recommend just taking the ends and kind of twisting them with your fingers, and that'll make the next step a little bit easier. And the next step is called tinting, and that's where you get solder on the wires. So what I'm going to do for this tinting process is I'm going to pinch the wire in these little jaws right here. Hang on, let me zoom in a little bit. Alright, so here's the wire in the jaws, and the process of tinting is quite simple. It is just taking the solder and getting it all over the wire. So let's get a bunch of solder on there. And you may have to rotate it. So once you've got that edge, rotate it, rotate it over and do the other side. So let's get the other side now. When soldering, it is very important that the soldering iron meets the solder at the tip or at the wire itself, because if it doesn't, then it's just all going to stick to the soldering iron. But anyway, that's a pretty well tinted wire. So now I'm going to do the other side, and then I'm going to put you guys back on. After you touch the solder to anything, I recommend scraping the solder up against something like steel wool, or there's this, which is like a copper scrubber, and that just kind of cleans off the tip so that it is nice and shiny like that. So I've got both wires tinted, so now let's move on to tinting the plug. So tinting the plug is a very similar process. What you do is you put the plug into whatever you're using to hold it, and then you're going to take your soldering iron and, whoa, okay, almost touched the cord of the soldering iron, or to the solder tip, and you're going to put the soldering iron in and just kind of fill up the plug with solder. And this might take a little bit while, and don't keep the soldering iron on the plug for too long, because it could melt the plastic on the plug. So that's pretty well tinted right there. As you can see, the plug is pretty well filled up with solder. So I'm gonna let that cool down, do the other side, and then I'm gonna put you guys back on. If you're worried about the actual contacts moving in the plastic housing, what you can do is plug the other half of the plug into the plug you're soldering, and that'll keep it lined up. I'm pretty careful, so I won't have to do that. But this is pretty cool down on that side, so now I'm going to do the other side, and then I'll put you guys back on with the next step. While you're waiting for the plug to cool down after you've tinted it, an important thing to remember to do is putting your heat shrink on. Can't tell you how many times I've forgotten to put my heat shrink on, soldered it all up, and then realized I have to desolder it to put the heat shrink on. And what does this do exactly? Well, the heat shrink is there to cover the exposed contact afterward. And it's just kind of like a safety thing. So I recommend doing that. Yeah, but I think the plug's cooled down now, so let's move on to actually soldering the plug. So we've gotten to the step where we're actually soldering the plug. Now, most plugs, if you can see right there, there's a little plus, and then on the other side there's a little minus. Most plugs have this, and the plus and minus correlates with the colors of the wire. Red is plus or positive, and black is minus or negative. So make sure that you get those correct, because if you accidentally mix those up and then plug a battery in, there is a very high chance that something is going to catch on fire. So don't make that mistake. But now it is simply time to solder these ends, and it's a pretty simple process. All you have to do is get the solder warm and melted, and then proceed to get the wire in it, and then remove the soldering iron before it cools. So I'm trying to get the solder to melt. It'll start to get shiny, which will be part of it. That'll let you know, the solder's getting hot. There, the solder's hot. So now I need to get the wire in and then remove the soldering iron. And now I would let go of the wire completely. Do not jiggle the wire around while the solder is cooling, because if you do, it'll create a bad joint, and that will give you a bad connection. But that wire is in, so you let that cool for a minute and then move on to the second wire. Alright, so the positive wire is now cooled down, so it's time to do the negative wire. And it's the same exact process as the positive wire. Yeah, so you just get the solder warmed up and melted. Get the wire in, mix it in, and then let go. Completely let go. This will allow the solder to cool, and you will have created a good, clean solder joint. So now let that cool off, and then we'll move on to the final step. Alright guys, so the plug is now fully cooled, and as you can see, the solder joint is pretty solid. So now it's time for the final step, and that is heat shrink tubing the contacts. You just slide it over like that and shrink the heat shrink. You can do this a couple different ways, as I mentioned. You can use a heat gun if you don't want to do soot, but because I don't really care about soot, a lighter is much faster. So I'm just going to use the lighter, shrink that up, shrink up the other one. So the lighter was out of fuel, so I'm going to use my butane-powered heat gun. So I'm just going to get it lit like that and use this to shrink the heat shrink. It's a little bit of a longer process, but it still works, I suppose. Yeah. So get this entirely heat shrinked, and then you're all done. Guys, if you made it to the end of the video, then congratulations, you have successfully soldered an RC battery connector. Here is the original plug that we took off of this engine heater, and it is now sporting a brand new XT60 style connector. As you can see, the ports are still perfectly centered and lined up, so this will plug in just fine. And it really wasn't a whole lot of work. And as you saw, even with the silver core solder, which is widely regarded as harder to solder, it was still quite simple to get a good joint. But with that, guys, I think that is going to do it for the end of part 1 of our soldering tutorial in our RC hobby. There will be a part 2 later on where I will show you how to solder smaller wires and motor wires. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, guys, thank you all for watching. If you did enjoy the video, please hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment in the section below for what videos you'd like to see next. But that's all for today, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.